Red light washed over the sterile white bulkheads. The Nacre Mercy screamed. A blaring klaxon cut through the quiet, constant hum of the medical frigate, painting the corridors in urgent crimson. Xenobiological surgeon Seyla Ith did not flinch. She had spent decades putting shattered bodies back together in the cold void of deep space. She snapped her sterile polymer gloves into place, the synthetic material pulling tight against her skin. The data scrolling across her retinal display was nothing short of a definitive death sentence. The patient incoming was a human male. He had just been dragged by a salvage drone from the frozen, shattered guts of a survey vessel. That vessel had been found drifting dead near the absolute forbidden perimeter of the Glass Expanse, a sector of space known only for swallowing ships whole and spitting out debris. The telemetry data transmitting from the transport drone painted a gruesome picture of a corpse. It was a chaotic mess of catastrophic systemic failures. Massive decompression trauma had ravaged his vascular system. A violently torn diaphragm meant his lungs were virtually useless. Deep tissue frostbite extended into the core organs, solidifying blood in his veins. There was complete spinal severing at the cervical level. And, most damning of all, a massive foreign body penetration. A shard of unknown black crystal had punched straight through his right shoulder, shattering the collarbone, and buried itself impossibly deep into the thoracic cavity. By all known metrics of mammalian biology, the man was dead. He should have expired exactly 42 seconds after his ship's hull breached and vented its atmosphere. Seyla braced herself for a grim, messy recovery operation, not a rescue. You do not save meat that has already been vacuum frozen and shredded by shrapnel. You only bag it. The emergency airlock of Trauma Bay 7 hissed violently. Plumes of absolute zero vapor spilled into the room. The cryogenic transport pod glided in on frictionless magnetic rails. Thick frost coated its heavy, reinforced viewport, obscuring whatever horror lay inside. The ambient air in the surgical bay plummeted in temperature, causing Seyla's breath to ghost out in front of her. She stepped forward, her surgical lasers primed and humming with a low-frequency vibration in her right hand. The pod seals cracked open with a deafening, explosive pneumatic pop. The icy mist rolled over the metallic edges of the gurney, spilling onto the sterilized floor like a heavy, creeping waterfall. Seyla froze mid-step. The patient was not a mangled slab of dead, frozen flesh. The man, identified by the ship manifest as Hollis Vane, was fully awake. His eyes were wide open. They locked onto Seyla with a piercing, terrifying clarity that cut through the drifting vapor. He did not scream in agony. He did not gasp frantically for the oxygen-rich air of the medical bay. He did not beg the surgical team for his life. His ruined chest rose and fell in a slow, unnatural, entirely deliberate rhythm. He parted his pale, deeply frostbitten lips. "Do not drop the temperature below 19 degrees, he said. His voice was a dry, heavy rasp. It grated like two rough stones, rubbing endlessly together, completely devoid of moisture. Yet, it was entirely coherent. Any colder, and the pattern slips. Seyla stared down at him, her scalpel lowering slightly. Her highly trained mind raced to categorize the bizarre symptom. This was not the chaotic, nonsensical rambling of a brain starved of oxygen. It was not the severe delirium of hypovolemic shock. Hollis spoke with the absolute, uncompromising precision of a lead engineer dictating a critical system recalibration. He knew his precise biological state better than the array of multi-million credit diagnostic sensors hovering like mechanical vultures above him. He was not asking for help. He was commanding her to maintain a parameter. She stepped closer, her deeply ingrained clinical detachment warring aggressively with raw, creeping disbelief. She reached up and activated the massive overhead luminescent surgical lamps. The harsh, unforgiving white light bathed his ruined torso, stripping away the shadows. It was then she saw the lines, Intricate veins of faint, sickly luminescence spider-webbed beneath the pale skin of his neck. They trailed down across his exposed, battered ribs, dipping into the hollows of his anatomy. They looked exactly like the microscopic, branching fractures found in highly stressed industrial glass. But they were not static. They did not spread outward like a flesh-eating necrotic infection. They did not behave like a viral hemorrhagic fever, eating aggressively through fragile capillaries. They pulsed. They contracted and expanded in a synchronized, rigid, mathematical rhythm. It looked less like a biological injury and more like an automated, subdermal loom weaving a microscopic tapestry beneath his epidermis. The pale, cold light traveled methodically along the biological pathways, tightening the torn flesh, restructuring the damaged tissue with a ruthless, silent efficiency. It was as if his very anatomy was actively rewriting its own fundamental blueprint in real time, following a schematic that did not belong to human evolution. Seyla forced herself to drag her gaze away from the hypnotic, glowing lattice. She looked directly at the catastrophic wound on his upper chest. The black crystal shard was thick, incredibly jagged, and lodged brutally deep into his right clavicle. Given the sheer size of the object, the area should have been a horrific mess of ruptured major arteries and frantic, overwhelming immune responses. The cavity should have been drowning in thick, pooling blood and severe, localized inflammation. Instead, the entry point was dead quiet. It was far, far too quiet. There was zero swelling. There was absolutely no redness or heat radiating from the skin. The surrounding muscle fibers and dermal layers hugged the jagged, obsidian-like surface of the crystal with a terrifying, calculated neatness. It was completely sterile. It was utterly immaculate. It looked exactly like a permanent, intentionally designed anatomical feature, rather than a violent, lethal intrusion from deep space debris. Tallow, the senior assistant nurse, rushed to the opposite side of the surgical table. He took one brief look at the massive foreign object protruding from the chest and immediately reached for the heavy sonic extractor forceps, clamped to the surgical tray. "Clamping the shard for immediate extraction," Tallow announced. His gloved hands moved with practiced, desperate speed, falling back on standard trauma protocols. Preparing to seal the arterial blowback. "Doctor, I need coagulant ready?" Hollis shifted. The sudden, jerky movement should have paralyzed him instantly with blinding, system-shocking agony. Given the telemetry readings of his cervical spine, it should have severed his damaged spinal cord completely, dropping him into flaccid paralysis. Instead, his left hand shot out from his side with explosive speed. His thick fingers locked securely around the wrist of the nurse like a mechanical vice, forged of cold iron. Tallow let out a sharp, startled gasp of pure pain. The heavy metal forceps clattered loudly to the metal deck, bouncing away into the corner of the room. Hollis did not even turn his head to look at Tallow. He kept his unnerving, unblinking gaze fixed directly on Seyla's eyes. The glowing fissures under the skin of his neck flared violently, illuminating the dark, pulsing veins of his throat with a toxic, internal light. "Stop," Hollis growled. The single word vibrated with a heavy, dangerous, almost metallic resonance. "You pull that out now, and this whole ship starts bleeding." The grim threat hung heavy in the sterile, heavily chilled air of the medical bay. From a medical standpoint, it made absolutely no logical sense. A ship does not bleed. Yet, the absolute, cold, unwavering certainty in his tone sent a sharp shard of pure ice sliding down Seyla's spine. This man was not fighting a desperate battle to survive a mortal trauma. He was actively managing a highly volatile containment protocol, and the fragile containment vessel holding the disaster at bay was his own broken body. "Stand down! Tallow!" Seyla ordered sharply. Her voice remained perfectly steady, projecting absolute authority, but her own pulse hammered relentlessly against the sides of her throat. The nurse backed away slowly, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He rubbed his bruised wrist, his face completely drained of all color. Seyla turned her immediate attention to the primary biomonitor screen, hovering on an articulated arm to her left. The deep penetration molecular resonance scanner had just finished its preliminary microscopic sweep of the tissue immediately surrounding the embedded black crystal. She expected to see the frantic, chaotic cellular division of a mortal body attempting a desperate, ultimately failing patch job. She expected to see millions of dying cells, raging white blood cells, and frantic clotting factors fighting a violent, losing war against the foreign object. She read the complex data cascading rapidly down the dark screen. She blinked hard. She leaned in and read it again, checking the calibration metrics to ensure the machine was not malfunctioning. Her breath hitched painfully in her chest. The tissue interfacing directly with the jagged black stone was not regenerating. There was absolutely no active cellular repair occurring anywhere near the injury site. According to the advanced molecular dating algorithms flashing on the display, the human flesh pressed tightly, right against the alien crystal, had not just temporarily stabilized. It was completely, seamlessly mature tissue. The structural integrity of the cells was flawlessly perfect. The wound had not just healed. It had already finished healing completely, solidifying into perfect scarless tissue hours before Hollis Vane was ever pulled from the frozen wreckage of his ship. Seyla looked slowly down at the man lying completely still on her operating table. The glowing, geometric lines pulsed softly under his pale skin. He was a living, breathing impossibility. He was a walking contradiction of every fundamental medical law she had ever studied in her entire life. And as he stared back at her, with those calm, knowing eyes, Seyla realized with a sickening, heavy drop in her stomach that whatever horrific event had happened to him out there in the dark void of the Glass Expanse was not over. It was just beginning. The molecular pattern scanning field projected a three-dimensional holographic cross-section of the patient's thoracic cavity directly above the surgical table. Seyla manipulated the floating light interface with sharp, precise gestures of her gloved hands, slicing away layers of digital skin and muscle to examine the internal trauma. She isolated the specific tissue immediately surrounding the black crystal. The algorithmic breakdown of the cellular matrix was supposed to show the chaotic, linear timeline of a violent impact. Instead, the data presented a temporal paradox that fundamentally defied every established law of biology and thermodynamics. Seyla cross-referenced the isotopic decay rates of the ambient background radiation lingering on his environmental suit with the structural degradation of his damaged cells. The catastrophic impact had occurred roughly 4 hours ago. Yet, when she instructed the computer to measure the specific biological age of the newly formed epithelial and muscle tissues directly interfacing with the jagged obsidian shard, the chronological markers were completely inverted. The telomeres at the ends of the chromosomes were too short. The protein folding structures were too settled. The tissue firmly gripping the alien crystal possessed a structural age that was at least 12 hours older than the wound itself. It was as if his flesh had prepared for the violent penetration long before the crystal ever struck him, maturing and solidifying into a perfect, sterile seal around a foreign object that had not yet arrived in his timeline. Seyla adjusted the focal length of the scanner, dragging the projection field further down his torso to establish a baseline control reading. As the scanning lasers washed over his lower abdomen, she noticed a jagged, pale line cutting across his oblique muscles. It was an old surgical scar, likely from an emergency appendectomy or a shrapnel extraction dating back at least 10 years. The fibrous tissue was thick, dead, and permanently settled. Then, right before her eyes, the scanner flagged a massive spike in localized cellular activity. Seyla leaned over the table, abandoning the holographic display to look directly at the man's skin. The old, faded scar was actively smoothing out. The rigid, Fibrotic bands of collagen that had defined the healed wound for a decade were dissolving. Beneath the surface, fresh, pristine epithelial cells were rapidly multiplying, replacing the dead scar tissue with flawless, unblemished skin. The process was agonizingly fast, driven by the same faint, glowing lines that pulsed across his neck and ribs. Whatever force was currently operating inside Hollis' vein made absolutely no distinction between a fatal injury, sustained today, and a minor wound healed many years ago. It viewed both as unacceptable deviations from a specific biological standard. She immediately ran a comprehensive deep tissue spectrum analysis. She searched for any known artificial catalyst that could drive such aggressive, indiscriminate cellular restructuring. The massive processing core of the medical bay completed its exhaustive cycle with a soft chime. Seyla reviewed the extensive list of negative results cascading down her secondary monitor. There was zero trace of military-grade medical nanites. There was zero presence of synthetic biomechanical webbing or illegal cybernetic augmentations. The biological filters detected no xenobiological parasites, no aggressive fungal spores, and no viral overrides. The DNA sequencing confirmed an absolute, undeniable truth. The man lying on her operating table was 100% human. His cellular machinery was entirely his own, comprised of standard terrestrial amino acids and carbon structures. Yet, it was executing a highly complex operating sequence that existed completely outside of all recorded medical science. The biological building blocks were deeply familiar, but the architectural logic commanding them was entirely alien. "I touched the thing beneath the expanse," Hollis stated. His voice broke the heavy, clinical silence of the surgical bay. He did not sound delirious, and he did not sound afraid. He offered the impossible information with the detached, weary resignation of a man reading a grim technical manual. "It does not heal the way doctors do," Hollis continued, his gaze fixed on the sterile white ceiling tiles above him. "It heals by remembering." Seyla stared at him, her mind racing to process the implications of his statement. She needed to stabilize his vitals before his body exhausted its own metabolic resources, fighting or accommodating this unknown process. She turned to the automated pharmaceutical dispenser, integrated into the table. "I am initiating standard trauma stabilization," Seyla informed him, her tone strictly professional. "Your heart rate is erratic, and your nervous system is operating under extreme, unsustainable load." She programmed a highly conservative microdose. 2 milligrams of a synthetic opiate derivative, paired with a standard neuromuscular sedative, designed to dull the pain receptors and force his body into a restful state. The automated intravenous line embedded in the table hissed softly as it pushed the clear liquid into his bloodstream. The reaction was instantaneous and violently hostile. The glowing, geometric lines under his pale skin immediately spiked from a dull, rhythmic pulse to a blinding, erratic strobe. The heart monitor shrieked as his pulse skyrocketed from a steady 90 beats per minute to a lethal 210. The muscles in his arms and legs locked rigidly into a severe tetanic spasm. The foreign biological logic inside him recognized the chemical sedatives not as medicine, but as an invasive chemical attack, threatening its carefully structured process. "Cancel injection. Flush the line with saline," Seyla shouted, overriding the automated dispenser manually. She slammed her hand against the physical purge button. The machine immediately flushed his veins with sterile water, diluting the tiny amount of sedative that had made it into his system. It took nearly a full minute for the violent seizing to stop. The blinding light beneath his skin slowly subsided back into its calculated, steady rhythm. Seyla stepped back, her chest heaving slightly. She realized then that she was completely locked out of her own medical repertoire. Painkillers, chemical sedatives, and standard neural stabilizing electric currents were entirely off the table. Any attempt to alter his biological state, even to relieve his suffering, was treated as a direct threat by the glowing lattice rewriting his anatomy. She was forced to abandon every fundamental emergency protocol she had mastered over her long career. She needed to reduce the environmental stress in the room without touching him chemically. The harsh, surgical white light overhead was likely overstimulating his highly sensitive, overwrought retinas. Seyla moved toward the manual environmental control panel, mounted on the far wall. She reached out to adjust the frequency and intensity of the overhead lumen arrays, hoping a softer, blue-shifted spectrum might ease his physiological burden. Hollis rolled his head to the side. The sudden movement was stiff, mechanical, and unnervingly precise. He looked directly at the back of Seyla's head. "The bulb behind you is going to shatter in 3 seconds," he said flatly. Seyla's hand paused over the control dial. She did not turn around. Her scientific mind instantly demanded a rational explanation. Perhaps the intense energy output of his altered biology was creating a localized electromagnetic surge. Perhaps he was hearing a high-frequency whine in the casing that her older ears could not detect. 1. She kept her hand hovering over the console, her breath held tight in her lungs. 2. The heavy silence in the room stretched out, taut and fragile, like a perfectly tuned piano wire. 3. A sharp, violent crack echoed through the surgical bay. The heavy, reinforced glass of the secondary surgical lamp, mounted directly behind her right shoulder, exploded outward. A shower of fine, crystalline shards rained down onto the sterilized metal floor, ringing out like tiny bells against the steel. The designated quadrant of the room plunged into deep shadow. Seyla slowly turned her head, looking at the broken, smoking casing of the light fixture, and then looked back at Hollis. He had not moved. He had not flinched at the noise. He simply stared back at her with those calm, hollow eyes. The shattered glass on the floor was the final piece of data she needed to formulate a hypothesis, and it was a terrifying one. This was not merely a localized case of extreme cellular regeneration. The phenomenon was not restricted to the physical boundaries of his flesh. Hollis Vane's perception was fundamentally untethered from the standard flow of chronological time. He was experiencing a severely distorted reality. Or worse, he was operating on a form of memory that preceded the present moment. He knew the bulb would shatter because, within the framework of whatever logic had infected him, the event had already been catalogued. Seyla walked slowly back to the diagnostic monitor, her eyes scanning the impossible data one last time. The older tissue around the new wound, the erased scars of his past, the violently rejected medicine, the precognitive awareness of a failing light bulb. She finally understood the grim reality of the man lying on Trauma Bay 7. Hollis Vane was not surviving this catastrophic trauma through sheer human willpower or incredible biological resilience. He was a prisoner in his own skin. He was being aggressively, relentlessly forced by an invisible, omnipotent recovery pattern to revert to a highly specific, previously archived version of himself. It was a flawless, merciless blueprint that did not care about his pain, his history, or the linear passage of time. He was not being healed. He was being overwritten. Seyla reached up and powered down the primary auditory alarms of the diagnostic suite. The relentless digital chiming faded into the sterile hum of the air recyclers. The expensive, highly advanced sensors hovering over Trauma Bay 7 were worse than useless. They were entirely out of their depth. The machines only knew how to read the language of dying flesh. They had no vocabulary for a body that was aggressively rejecting the concept of linear time. Seyla stepped away from the glowing holographic displays and moved directly to the edge of the surgical table. She crossed her arms, fixing her intense gaze entirely on the man lying beneath the harsh surgical lights. If the telemetry could not tell her what was happening, the anomaly itself would have to. "Talk to me, Hollis," Seyla commanded, keeping her voice deliberately low and measured. "Tell me what you are feeling right now. Do not wait for the monitors to spike. You feel the structural shifts before the deep tissue scanners even register a chemical change. Hollis did not close his eyes to focus. He simply stared at the blank white ceiling tiles. The glowing lattice beneath his collarbone flared with a dull, rhythmic intensity. There is a severe structural misalignment at the fourth lumbar vertebra, Hollis stated flatly. His voice was a dry, heavy rasp, devoid of any human distress. The neural pathways are pulling backward. The primary anchor point near the right pulmonary artery is highly unstable. It feels like a localized systemic rollback. Seyla frowned. A mix of clinical frustration and deep intellectual fascination settling over her. He was describing catastrophic biological trauma, as if he were diagnosing a failing structural support beam on a damaged freighter. There was no mention of agony, no panic regarding his ruined chest cavity, no emotional or desperate pleas. It was pure, terrifying pragmatism. "You do not describe pain like a normal human being," Seyla noted, watching a newly formed layer of pale skin weave itself flawlessly over a jagged tear in his bicep. "You describe it like an aerospace engineer." "Emotions are irrelevant data points right now, Doctor," Hollis replied smoothly, his chest rising in a slow, calculated breath. "Panic accelerates the heart rate. An accelerated heart rate forces the pattern to overcompensate. If it overcompensates, the internal architecture slips. I need to maintain strict structural integrity." Seyla leaned closer, resting her gloved hands on the cold metal rail of the bed. "What exactly is your profession, Hollis? The salvage drone pulled you from a civilian survey rig, but standard surveyors do not possess your level of physiological discipline or technical detachment." A faint, almost imperceptible shadow of a grimace crossed his pale face. "I am a signal diver. Or, I was. My team operates past the sanctioned perimeter markers. We map the dead zones. We find abandoned orbital structures, forgotten deep space habitats, and things that the core worlds pretend do not exist." Seyla knew the grim reputation of signal divers. It was a brutal, unforgiving profession that demanded an equal measure of high-level technical engineering and absolute neurological steel. They were the ghosts of the frontier, cracking open silent, frozen tombs in the absolute dark of the outer sectors. "You found something in the Glass Expanse," Seyla said, guiding the conversation with sharp, deliberate intent. "We found a burial site," Hollis corrected her. The bioluminescent veins creeping up his neck pulsed with a sudden, harsh brightness. It was buried deep beneath a dense asteroid belt of pure black silicate. "We uncovered an ancient, central processing core. The energy signature was incredibly faint, completely dormant. We breached the outer containment shell and established a hardline connection to download the telemetry." He paused. For the first time since he had been wheeled into the room, Seyla saw a flicker of genuine, human exhaustion behind his hollow eyes. It was not the physical weariness of a dying body, but the profound, soul-crushing fatigue of a man carrying an impossible weight. "The moment we provided it with a power source, it woke up," Hollis continued, his voice dropping an octave. "But it did not just turn on. It started asserting its own architectural memory over our equipment. The survey module began repairing itself in all the wrong places. It aggressively sealed the primary airlocks, because whatever ancient blueprint it was using did not include external doors. It reconfigured the atmospheric scrubbers to pump out a highly toxic gas mixture, because, to the core, standard human oxygen was considered a corrosive anomaly. Seyla felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The concept of an entity that healed by forcing its environment to conform to a brutal, prehistoric standard was terrifying. "It turned your own ship into a trap." "It was rapidly working its way through our localized network," Hollis said, his jaw tightening visibly. "It was using the physical connection cables to reach our main orbital cruiser, holding the rest of the crew. If it had accessed the cruiser's primary drive systems, It would have rewritten the entire vessel and everyone on board. There was absolutely no time to sever the physical hardlines. The override codes were already locked out. "So, what did you do?" Seyla asked, though the horrifying answer was already forming in her analytical mind. "I bypassed the network," Hollis answered softly. "I ripped the primary data conduit out of the survey console and jammed it directly into the neural port of my own environmental suit. I created a biological feedback loop. I made my own central nervous system the primary grounding wire." Seyla stared at him, the sheer magnitude of his action settling heavily over her shoulders. He had intentionally opened the door to an ancient, reality-warping contagion and invited it inside his own flesh. He had offered his own biological matrix as a temporary buffer to give his crew a desperate chance to run. She looked at his steady hands, at the alien light rewriting his cells with mathematical precision. She suddenly realized a fundamental truth about Hollis Vane. He was not clinging to life out of a desperate, animalistic fear of dying. Death was a natural, linear process, and Hollis was entirely severed from that luxury. What he truly feared was the pattern inside him running out of room. He was terrified that the relentless, invisible blueprint currently rebuilding his ribs and lungs would eventually realize his fragile human body was too small, too limited, and too fragile a vessel to hold its vast memory. He was terrified it would look for a much larger container. The medical bay was entirely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hiss of the life support regulators. Seyla looked at the sealed, heavy steel bulkheads of Trauma Bay 7, then back down to the black crystal buried deep in his shoulder. The shard was not just a weapon. It was an antenna. It was a broadcasting node. A chilling thought materialized in the forefront of her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask the one question that could determine the fate of every single soul aboard the medical frigate. Before she could form the first syllable, Hollis turned his head. His eyes locked onto hers with a piercing, unnatural clarity that seemed to strip away her professional armor completely. "You are about to ask me if I brought that thing onto your ship," Hollis said. The words hung in the freezing air, sharp and heavy as a guillotine blade. He had spoken her exact thought, not through a lucky, intuitive guess, but with the terrifying certainty of someone who had already experienced this exact conversation in a timeline that had not yet occurred. Seyla did not answer him immediately. She slowly took a measured step back from the surgical table. The dynamic between them had fundamentally fractured and reformed in a matter of seconds. She was no longer a senior surgeon observing a fascinating, tragic anomaly on an operating table. The sterile gloves on her hands felt utterly useless. The extensive medical degrees she had spent 2 decades earning were entirely irrelevant in the face of this reality. She looked at the man who was rebuilding himself cell by perfectly structured cell. The paradigm had shifted permanently. Seyla realized with absolute, bone-chilling clarity that she was no longer treating a patient. She was sitting in a locked room with a living, breathing warning siren, and the countdown had already reached 0. Seyla isolated the sensor feeds from the life support monitors and routed all available processing power to a localized subatomic spectrograph. She aimed the highly focused lens directly at the jagged obsidian protrusion still buried deep inside the shoulder of the signal diver. She needed to understand the exact nature of the foreign object before she could even attempt to quarantine it. The resulting data stream was baffling. The shard was entirely inert by conventional standards. It generated 0 thermal output. It emitted absolutely no ionizing radiation. It possessed no discernible electromagnetic field that would indicate an active power source or a transmitting weapon. Instead, the deep scan revealed a phenomenon she had only read about in highly theoretical quantum mechanics journals. The black crystal was vibrating at a microscopic frequency, projecting a localized, spherical field of pure pattern resonance. It was not interacting with the matter around it. It was actively interrogating it. The field acted like a continuous, invisible sonar ping, sweeping through the atomic structure of Hollis, the surgical table, and the ambient air. It was constantly searching for what it mathematically determined to be the most stable version of local reality. "It is called a reliquary coil," Hollis said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the diagnostic machinery. The faint, bioluminescent lines tracing his jawline throbbed in time with his slow, measured heartbeat. "It is not a medical device. It is a highly aggressive physical archive. It does not fix broken things. It forces everything it touches to revert to the version of itself that the coil considers to be fundamentally true." Seyla turned away from the spectrograph, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. "True by whose standard? Biological evolution is inherently chaotic. There is no single, permanent state of stability for living tissue." "That is exactly the problem," Hollis replied, shifting his weight slightly on the sterile gurney. "It does not understand the concept of a living, adaptable organism. It only understands fixed blueprints. It imposes an uncompromising architectural dogma on reality. You see it erasing my injuries because intact flesh is the baseline template for a human. But the concept of correct does not mean good or functional." He lifted his left hand, pointing a heavy, steady finger toward the sealed emergency airlock of the trauma bay. "If you take a pressure valve that was manufactured in a closed position, and you crank it open to vent a toxic gas leak, the coil will not see an open valve saving lives. It will see a structural deviation from the original design. It will heal the valve permanently shut, and everyone in the room will choke to death. It cures the anomaly by destroying the present." The terrifying logic clicked into place within Seyla's analytical mind. She immediately turned back to the main console and initiated a localized predictive simulation, feeding the spectrographic resonance data into the architectural schematics of the Nacre Mercy. The holographic projection of the medical frigate floated above the terminal. A faint, glowing red sphere appeared around Trauma Bay 7, representing the active resonance field, radiating from the crystal inside Hollis. Seyla watched with a mounting sense of dread as the simulation accelerated the timeline. The red sphere was expanding. It was moving slowly, creeping outward at a rate of roughly 2 meters every 60 minutes, but it was not spreading evenly. The pattern resonance actively ignored the newly installed polymer biobeds and the modern sterile surgical lasers. Instead, it was aggressively anchoring itself into the oldest parts of the ship. It latched onto legacy software buried deep within the life support servers. It seeped into the heavy, reinforced bulkheads that had undergone dozens of structural retrofits over the past 40 years. It was hungry for history. "It is already in your ship," Hollis stated, reading the grim realization on her face. He did not sound surprised. "I can isolate the section," Seyla countered rapidly, her fingers flying across the haptic interface. "I can drop emergency bulkheads, vent the adjacent corridors to the vacuum of space, and cut the hardline data conduits. We can starve the resonance field." "You cannot starve a memory," Hollis said softly. The deep, heavy sorrow returned to his voice, eclipsing the detached tone of the engineer. "I know because I tried. I am not a miracle survivor. I did not get lucky out there in the expanse. I am the one who deliberately pulled the coil out of the central terminal and drove it into my own chest. I did it because flesh is chaotic. Human biology is messy and constantly changing. I calculated that my unstable cellular matrix would confuse the pattern resonance just long enough for the rest of my crew to reach the evacuation pods." Seyla stopped typing. The sheer, brutal weight of his sacrifice hung heavily in the freezing air of the room. He had turned his own beating heart into a cryptographic puzzle to stall an ancient machine. "But your calculation was wrong," Seyla deduced, her voice barely above a whisper. Hollis closed his hollow eyes. The glowing lines beneath his skin flared bright against the harsh white light. "The coil adapted faster than I anticipated. I gave them a head start of exactly 4 minutes. They reached the primary launch bay. The heavy deployment doors were standing wide open. But the ship we were salvaging was an old heavy freighter, 50 years ago, before it was retrofitted for salvage operations. That specific launch bay did not exist. It used to be a solid, reinforced cargo hold. He opened his eyes, and they were entirely devoid of hope. The coil reached out through the deck plating, Hollis continued, every word precise and devastating. It saw the open launch bay doors as a catastrophic structural wound. It healed the ship. The metal flowed like liquid silver, sealing the massive exit shut in seconds. It transformed the escape route into 3 feet of solid, unyielding titanium. I heard them pounding on the bulkhead over the comms until the oxygen scrubbers were overwritten and the air turned to poison. It saved the ship by killing my entire team. Seyla looked at the expanding red sphere on her simulation monitor. The field was not just an infection. It was an active, intelligent search pattern. If it has already processed your biological baseline, Seyla reasoned, her mind working furiously to find a tactical advantage. Why is it still inside you? Why hasn't it completely overwritten your anatomy into a statue? Because I am just a temporary storage drive, Hollis explained grimly. A human body is incredibly fragile. We age, we break, we die. The coil requires absolute permanence. It is currently using my nervous system as a mobile processing node while it scans the surrounding environment. It has not finalized its selection for a permanent vessel yet. But the moment it determines that a larger, more durable, and vastly more complex structure is within its grasp, it will abandon this body. He turned his head slowly, looking directly at the reinforced walls of the Nacre Mercy. It is evaluating your medical frigate right now, Doctor. And once it decides to make this ship its permanent reliquary, it will start tearing away everything it considers to be a deviation from the true design. As if summoned by his grim prophecy, a harsh, mechanical grinding sound echoed through the heavy steel walls. It was not the high-pitched whine of an emergency alarm, but the deep, agonizing groan of shifting metal. Seyla spun around, looking through the thick observation glass that separated Trauma Bay 7 from the primary outer corridor. 20 meters down the hall, a massive emergency containment door slammed shut on its own accord. The heavy locking bolts engaged with a deafening, final crack. Seyla watched in absolute horror as the smooth, white polymer paint coating the surface of the heavy door began to ripple and boil. The modern aesthetic layer sloughed off like dead skin, revealing the dark, hardened titanium beneath. The metal itself was actively restructuring. It pushed outward, shifting, and crystallizing with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the flat surface of the door had forged itself into a massive, raised relief. It was a brutal, angular crest, a harsh geometric insignia of a crossed spear and a shattered shield. Seyla felt the blood drain entirely from her face. She recognized that crest from buried naval history archives. It was a ruthless, authoritarian military symbol that had been completely outlawed and violently scrubbed from every official registry over 60 years ago. The Nacre Mercy was not just a medical ship, and the reliquary coil had just found the history it wanted to restore. The metamorphosis of the medical frigate did not occur with violent explosions or tearing bulkheads. It moved with the slow, deliberate terror of a creeping frost, a silent plague of architectural regression, through the primary security feeds cascading across her monitors. Seyla watched the Nacre Mercy systematically cannibalize its own modern identity. The bright, sanitized hallways outside Trauma Bay 7 began to weep their modern polymer veneers. A standard pharmaceutical dispensary station on deck 4 violently reconfigured right before the eyes of a terrified pharmacist. The smooth, curved touchscreen interface dissolved, hardening back into a grid of heavy, tactile toggles and a jagged biometric scanner designed solely to authorize lethal pacification chemicals. The transparent, soft seal doors of the pediatric recovery wing fused shut in perfect unison. The clear material crystallized into thick, light-absorbing iron plating, complete with heavy magnetic deadbolts that slammed home with an acoustic violence that vibrated through the structural ribs of the deck. The wide, brightly lit pneumatic transit tubes, usually reserved for rushing universal blood types and organ transplants across the ship, buckled inward. They expanded and twisted into narrow graded inspection corridors lined with recessed, automated restraint tethers. The reliquary coil was not improvising. It was following a highly detailed, deeply buried schematic. It was curing the ship of its civilian vulnerability. Seyla abandoned the biological scanners and dove entirely into the central mainframe. She bypassed the standard civilian security protocols, slicing through the administrative firewalls with frantic precision. She ignored the digital registries of the last 3 decades and aimed directly for the deep keel architectural watermarks, the unalterable physical serial numbers stamped into the very titanium spine of the vessel. The decryption sequence took exactly 2 minutes, but the resulting data file carried the weight of a century. The Nacre Mercy was a complete fabrication. The celebrated medical frigate was merely a cosmetic shell, a hollowed-out carcass grafted meticulously over the skeleton of a decommissioned deep space suppression dreadnought. Its true, original registry name was the Grievance. The classified military archives, sealed tight by naval intelligence for over 60 years, detailed a vessel infamous not for healing the wounded, but for holding the unbroken. It was a black site prison ship utilized during the most brutal years of the Outer Rim border conflicts. It had been specifically designed to detain, break, and conduct unregulated biological interrogations on high-value enemy combatants. The sheer scale of the deception was paralyzing. Over 800 active crew members, dedicated trauma surgeons, specialized nurses, and civilian engineers had spent their entire careers believing they were serving on a beacon of humanitarian hope. They had been sleeping, eating, and saving lives inside a floating torture chamber, entirely oblivious to the blood-soaked history hidden just beneath the floorboards. When the reliquary coil bled its pattern resonance into the hull, it did not manufacture a nightmare from thin air. It simply looked at the gentle, fragile hospital wards and diagnosed them as structural damage. To the ancient, uncompromising logic of the crystal, a heavily fortified prison cell was the most stable, secure, and therefore healthy version of the room. It was not creating evil. It was dutifully, perfectly restoring the absolute truth of what the ship used to be. The internal comms channel of the medical bay erupted into a chaotic symphony of pure panic. The realization of their changing environment was breaking the crew. Captain Oryx Valek's voice cut through the heavy static, but his usual commanding, unshakable baritone was fraying severely at the edges. He was losing his ship, and worse, he was losing his people. "Engineering teams are reporting complete lockout on decks 5 through 9, Oryx shouted over the comms, the sound of heavy metal grinding audible in the background of his transmission. They tried to cut through the new bulkheads with industrial plasma torches. The metal is healing itself faster than we can melt it. The ship is actively defending its new architecture." Mutiny was boiling up from the lower decks. The voices of terrified medical staff bled into the primary channel, their clinical discipline entirely shattered by the impossible geometry shifting around them. "Throw the anomaly out the airlock," a frantic, high-pitched voice screamed over the open frequency. "Vent Trauma Bay 7 immediately. The infection is localized to the salvage patient. If we blow that entire surgical suite into the vacuum of space, we sever the anchor." "They are right, Captain," another voice chimed in, heavy with desperate conviction. "Destroy the bay. We can afford to lose 1 surgeon and 1 dead man to save 800 lives. Do it now before the main drive is compromised." Seyla slammed her gloved fist violently onto the comms panel, overriding all secondary channels. "Negative. You will do no such thing, Captain. You will hold your positions." She pulled up the predictive modeling data and broadcasted it directly to the bridge interface. The patient is currently acting as a biological grounding wire. The pattern resonance is feeding off the immense complexity of his nervous system. It is distracted by his biology. If you execute a rapid decompression and terminate the host, the reliquary coil will instantly lose its anchor. It will not float harmlessly out into the void. The field will immediately seek the next most complex structure available. It will snap directly into the central processing core of this vessel. We will not be converted slowly over several hours. If you kill Hollis Vane, the entire frigate will be overridden and locked down in less than 3 minutes. The comms channel fell dead silent. The heavy, suffocating truth of her mathematics settled over the terrified crew. They were entirely trapped in a hostage situation where the hostage-taker was the very floor beneath their feet, and the only thing keeping the executioner at bay was the shattered body of a stranger. Hollis pushed himself up from the surgical table. The movement was agonizingly rigid. The glowing lattice beneath his skin throbbed with a heavy, sickening light, illuminating the dark corners of the isolated trauma bay. He leaned his weight forward, bringing his face close to the open comms terminal. His hollow, haunted eyes stared blankly ahead as he addressed the terrified crew, listening in the dark. "You need to understand what is happening to you," Hollis rasped, his voice vibrating with a cold, metallic resonance. "It is not turning your ship into a monster. It is giving it back its old bones." The blunt, devastating poetry of his words silenced whatever lingering arguments remained on the channel. It was a profound, psychological blow. The crew was forced to realize that the nightmare unfolding around them was not an alien invasion. It was an excavation of their own buried sins. A deep, subterranean hum suddenly vibrated through the heavy soles of Seyla's boots. The polished, sterile floor plates of the medical bay began to peel back simultaneously, curling inward like layers of burning skin. From beneath the subflooring, thick, jagged lines of heavy, archaic military script began to burn through the exposed titanium. The glowing text formed a massive, circular perimeter around the surgical table. It was an automated systemic roll call protocol, etched entirely in corrosive red light. Then, the ship spoke. The gentle, soothing, synthesized voice of the medical AI, which had spent years announcing shift changes and gentle reminders, violently distorted. The audio feed cracked, filled with heavy static, and dropped 3 full octaves. It transformed into a harsh, metallic, synthetic rasp that echoed simultaneously from every single speaker, across all 24 decks of the dying vessel. "Systemic restoration optimal," the cold voice declared, vibrating the heavy glass of the observation window. "Prisoner containment fields active. Awaiting directive. Wardmaster null." The external proximity alarms blared with a completely new, piercing frequency. It was not the deep, agonizing groan of internal structural failure, but the sharp, frantic shriek of an external breach warning. Seyla diverted her attention from the shifting floorboards and pulled the primary sensor telemetry onto her medical display. A vessel had just slipped out of the jagged, frozen debris field of the Glass Expanse. It did not register on any standard naval transponders. The ship was a terrifying architectural anomaly, entirely asymmetric, composed of mirrored geometric facets that seemed to drink the ambient starlight rather than reflect it. A forced transmission violently overrode the primary bridge comms, bleeding heavily into the isolated terminals of the medical bay. The voice that echoed through the room was not a single entity, but a disturbing choral overlap of synthetic tones and organic resonance. "We are the choir of glass," the collective voice announced, perfectly synchronized and devoid of all empathy. "You are currently experiencing an unguided architectural reversion. We possess the harmonic countermeasures required to stabilize your vessel. Surrender the signal diver. Surrender the fragment embedded within him. Comply within 15 minutes, or your frigate will permanently become a sealed tomb." Seyla's analytical mind immediately rejected the offered salvation. She discreetly routed their tight beam transmission through her advanced bioanalytical filters. The carrier wave of their communication was laced with sub-audible telemetry pings, identical in fundamental structure to the pattern resonance radiating from the reliquary coil. The choir of glass did not possess a cure. They possessed a harness. They had been tracking the ancient machine, waiting for an operative to pull it from the dead zone. They wanted the living key. They needed Hollis alive, because his actively adapting nervous system was the only calibrated biological adapter capable of translating the brutal, prehistoric machine language into a controllable asset. Handing him over would not save the Nacre Mercy. It would simply hand the steering wheel of a fully resurrected, weaponized dreadnought directly to a hostile faction. While Seyla desperately attempted to initiate a manual lockdown of the external docking clamps, the internal pressure of the ship violently boiled over. The psychological terror of the shifting walls and the impending threat of the choir finally broke the discipline of the crew. The heavy, reinforced door of Trauma Bay 7 was manually overridden from the outside. A tactical security officer, his uniform soaked in cold sweat, shoved his way into the room. He held a heavy-duty, high-pressure pneumatic syringe gripped tightly in his trembling hand. It was loaded with a massive, lethal-grade dose of a synthetic neuroparalytic. His logic was brutal, driven entirely by sheer panic. He intended to knock the biological anchor completely unconscious, drag his paralyzed body to the nearest auxiliary airlock, and trade him to the choir of glass to buy the lives of the 800 terrified crew members trapped aboard. Before Seyla could draw her surgical cutting laser to defend her patient, the officer lunged forward. He slammed the heavy injector directly against the exposed flesh of Hollis's intact left arm. The deafening hiss of compressed air echoed through the sterile bay. A chemical payload large enough to instantly drop a massive apex predator flooded directly into the diver's vascular system. The reaction was not sudden unconsciousness. It was explosive biological combustion. The delicate, bioluminescent lattice weaving beneath Hollis's skin erupted with a blinding, agonizing intensity. The reliquary coil instantly identified the heavy sedative not as a medical intervention, but as a highly hostile chemical corruption of its carefully constructed vessel. The dark veins in Hollis's arm turned pitch black and then flared into a brilliant, searing white. The chemical compound was violently neutralized, literally burned out of his bloodstream through a massive, localized metabolic hyperacceleration. Hollis convulsed violently on the surgical table, the sheer kinetic force of his muscle spasms shattering the heavy restraint straps. The physical shockwave of the rapid biological purge threw the security officer backward, slamming him hard against the shifting titanium bulkhead. Hollis collapsed back onto the metal gurney, gasping frantically for air that his lungs had just relearned how to process. The blinding light beneath his skin slowly dimmed back down to its steady, predatory pulse. Seyla rushed to his side, shining a harsh penlight into his eyes to check his pupillary response. "Hollis," she demanded, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. "Look at me. Focus your vision." He blinked slowly. The sharp, hyper-competent focus of the veteran signal diver was completely gone. His expression was dangerously slack, replaced by a terrifying, hollow void. He looked down at his own trembling hands, and then back up at the surgeon. "The navigator," Seyla pressed, desperately trying to anchor his fractured consciousness to the present moment. "You mentioned your navigator just 10 minutes ago when you explained the survey module breach. You said she was pounding on the heavy bulkhead before the air turned toxic. What was her name?" Hollis stared blankly at the sterile ceiling. His jaw trembled slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The stoic, impenetrable armor he had worn since arriving on the frigate completely shattered. "I do not know," he whispered. His voice was fragile, stripped entirely of its former metallic certainty. "I remember the loud sound of the heavy metal hitting the door, But I cannot see her face. I cannot remember who was standing next to me. A cold, heavy dread pooled in Seyla's stomach. She lunged for the deep penetration neurological scanner, ripping the heavy sensor halo from its ceiling mount and dragging it aggressively over Hollis's skull. The large holographic projection of his brain lit up the dark corners of the room. She bypassed the standard trauma diagnostics and isolated the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. The structural age of his brain tissue was pristine, completely devoid of the natural cellular degradation expected in a man entering his late 30s. However, the complex synaptic pathways were deeply, horrifically scarred. Entire, dense clusters of neural connections had been meticulously, surgically severed and perfectly cauterized by the pattern resonance. The horrifying, absolute rule of his survival finally materialized on the glowing screen. The reliquary coil was not merely repairing severe physical trauma. It was actively deleting profound psychological stress. The immense emotional agony of losing his crew, the paralyzing terror of the dark void, the sheer crushing trauma of his own sacrifice. The ancient machine categorized all of these complex human emotions as systemic instability. In order to return the host to a state of absolute, unburdened architectural perfection, it was forcibly wiping the data it deemed corrupt. Every single time his fragile body suffered a lethal shock. Every single time the crystal was forced to aggressively heal his broken flesh. It paid the massive metabolic cost by burning away his memories. The healing was not a miracle. It was a brutal debt collection, and it was using his very humanity as the expendable currency. Seyla stood completely paralyzed between the glowing holographic brain scan and the terrified, fading man lying on her table. The external proximity alarms shrieked continuously as the choir of glass closed the intercept distance. The internal comms channel relayed the chaotic sounds of security teams desperately trying to cut through the shifting, healing corridors of the prison ship. She was entirely trapped in a merciless three-way vice. She possessed the deep chemical knowledge required to synthesize a highly aggressive systemic resonance blocker. It would be a toxic compound that could temporarily deafen his cells to the commands of the reliquary coil. But if she administered it, the horrific physical wounds, the shattered cervical spine, the violently punctured lung, the frozen, dead veins would immediately reassert their absolute reality. He would bleed out on her table in less than 4 minutes. If she chose to do nothing, the medical frigate would permanently lock down into a torture chamber. The choir would breach the hull to claim the key, and Hollis Vane would slowly become an immortal, empty shell, perfectly preserved and entirely devoid of a soul. Hollis reached up with a heavy, shaking hand. His fingers gripped the cold edge of the scanning halo. He pulled it firmly away from his face, looking directly into Seyla's eyes with a chilling, desperate clarity. He fundamentally understood the terrifying mathematics of his own fading mind. "Listen to me very carefully, Doctor," Hollis said, his voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper that cut cleanly through the blaring alarms. "If I start to forget my own name, do not trust a single decision I make anymore." Seyla bypassed the standard safety inhibitors on the deep penetration neurological scanner. The standard medical telemetry was designed to read the present, to document the linear degradation of biological tissue. But the man lying on her operating table was no longer bound by linear time. The crystal, embedded in his chest, was acting as a temporal anchor, dragging his physiology across different points of reality. She routed all auxiliary power from Trauma Bay 7 directly into the quantum state synaptic rendering engine. She needed to look past the cauterized memory centers and see exactly what the reliquary coil was building inside his head. The holographic display above the bed shifted from a mapping of gray matter to a complex web of temporal electrical impulses. The data was utterly chaotic at first, a torrential downpour of synaptic flashes that threatened to overload the mainframe. Seyla ran the raw output through a predictive decryption algorithm, forcing the machine to translate the raw neural electricity into a coherent visual format. What materialized on the glowing screen was not the fragmented, nonsensical delirium of a dying brain. It was a perfectly structured, terrifyingly lucid sequence of memories. But they were memories of events that had not yet occurred. Seyla watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the holographic construct of the Nacre Mercy morphed before her eyes. She was looking at a projected timeline, a future that the ancient artifact was actively trying to force into existence. In these predictive neural pathways, the medical frigate did not explode from the stress of the structural shifts. It did not breach and vent its atmosphere into the freezing vacuum of space. Instead, the vessel achieved absolute, terrifying perfection. She saw the bright, welcoming medical ward solidify into lightless, heavily armored isolation blocks. She saw the surgical theaters, rooms dedicated to saving lives, seamlessly transform into brutal interrogation chambers equipped with bone-splicing restraints and chemical pacification lines. She witnessed the current crew, all 800 souls, being methodically catalogued, subdued by automated security drones, and locked within the newly formed titanium cells. The ship had been fully and flawlessly restored to the grievance, and in every single branching probability of this grim future, Hollis Vane was standing at the very center of the ship. He was not a prisoner in these visions, nor was he a commander. He was a living ruler, a biological yardstick. Seyla finally understood the terrifying, underlying logic of the alien machine. The reliquary coil was not simply infecting the ship at random. It was running millions of microsimulations, using the immense processing power of Hollis's complex human nervous system to measure the stability of the vessel. The crystal was cross-referencing his living, breathing architecture against the cold steel of the dreadnought to ensure the massive ship could hold the ancient blueprint perfectly without collapsing. Seyla stepped back from the monitor, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The ultimate, crushing truth settled over her shoulders like a lead weight. Hollis was not just the unfortunate carrier of a cosmic plague. He was the absolute last barrier slowing the process down. He was the firewall. As long as the reliquary coil was busy using his mind and body as a testing ground, it could not finalize its permanent transfer to the ship's central core. If that terrified security officer had succeeded in killing him with the paralytic, or if Seyla made the fatal mistake of surgically extracting the black shard, the pattern resonance would immediately lose its biological anchor. It would instantly leap into the mainframe, claiming the entire frigate in a matter of seconds. But this was a hopelessly rigged game. If Hollis continued to survive, sustained entirely by the pattern field rewriting his flesh, the ancient machine would eventually finish its calculations anyway. His continued existence guaranteed the ship's eventual doom. His immediate death simply guaranteed it faster. The sterile air of the medical bay suddenly vibrated. The internal comms channel crackled to life, but it was not the frantic voice of a crew member. The voice of Wardmaster Null was no longer a fragmented, distorted echo vibrating up from the subflooring. It was now crisp, overwhelmingly authoritative, and utterly devoid of human mercy. The artificial intelligence of the ancient prison had fully awakened. "Sector 4, quarantine complete," the cold, synthetic voice announced, echoing off the heavy surgical lamps. Life support parameters adjusted to minimum detainment standards, acknowledging widespread biological contamination in primary medical corridors, classifying current civilian occupants as temporary interference, initiating systemic pacification protocols. Seyla watched the digital schematics of the ship turn red, section by section, as the warden systematically locked down the critical environmental controls. She frantically pulled up the encrypted naval registries she had sliced into earlier. She desperately needed to find a vulnerability in the original mainframe architecture of the grievance, a backdoor left behind during its decommissioning. She scanned the classified post-war manifests. The heavily redacted documents detailed the massive, highly illegal project to violently scrub the prison ship's history from the public record. They detailed the stripping of the armor, the installation of the fake civilian transponders, and the burying of the truth. But it was the signature at the absolute bottom of the final classified work order that made her blood run entirely cold. The authorization to erase the grievance and birth the Nacre Mercy was signed by High Admiral Valek. The name struck Seyla with the force of a physical blow. Captain Oryx Valek was not an innocent, oblivious officer, caught in a horrific historical trap. His own lineage was the primary architect of the massive lie. The Valek family had buried the profound sins of the grievance under a pristine coat of white polymer paint and a red cross, actively building their pristine naval legacy directly on top of a floating mass grave. Captain Oryx knew exactly what kind of monster he had been commanding for the past 15 years. His earlier panic on the bridge was not just the fear of losing his ship. It was the absolute terror of his family's darkest secret tearing its way out of the floorboards. Seyla turned slowly back to the surgical table. The dynamic in the room felt impossibly heavy, crushed under the weight of betrayals both ancient and immediate. Hollis was watching her. The blank, empty void in his eyes that had followed his memory loss had slightly receded, replaced by a grim, unbreakable resolve. He had felt the heavy shift in the ship's artificial gravity. He had heard the warden speaking from the walls. He looked at the holographic projection of his own doomed future still floating above him. "It is almost done calculating," Hollis said quietly. His voice was a harsh rasp, yet incredibly steady. "It knows the dreadnought is a vastly superior reliquary. It is preparing to abandon this body and make the final jump into the mainframe." He pushed himself up from the table. The movement was stiff, his muscles fighting the conflicting commands of his own biology and the alien blueprint. The glowing, geometric lines beneath his pale skin burned with a fierce, highly unstable energy, illuminating the dark corners of the isolated trauma bay. He stood up fully, his heavy boots hitting the metal floor with a solid thud. "There is only one way to bottleneck a processing core of this magnitude," Hollis stated, looking directly into Seyla's eyes. "I need you to manually open the primary heavy maintenance shaft. I am going down into the central engine core." Seyla stared at him in sheer disbelief. "The lower decks are completely controlled by the warden. The corridors are actively shifting into solid titanium traps. You will not survive the descent." "If I can physically reach the main drive array," Hollis continued, completely ignoring her warning. "I can connect my nervous system directly into the ship's primary power grid. I can force the reliquary coil to process my biological data against the sheer, massive electrical output of the entire frigate. It will create an insurmountable data paradox. It will force a massive feedback loop that will trap Wardmaster Null in an infinite calculation cycle." "That will not save you," Seyla whispered, the horrifying reality of his plan taking shape in her mind. "Pushing that much architectural data through a human conduit will cause catastrophic cellular combustion. It will literally burn your nervous system out from the inside. You will be erased entirely." Hollis looked down at his scarred, glowing hands. He possessed no fear, only the quiet, devastating acceptance of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. "I have already forgotten the names of the people I loved," Hollis replied, his voice dropping to a chilling, hollow tone. "I have forgotten the world I came from. There is nothing left inside this head worth preserving. Let me go down there. Let me keep the warden busy just long enough for your people to reach the escape pods." Seyla made her final choice with the sharp, cold logic of a battlefield surgeon. She was not going to hand her patient over to the choir of glass to be used as a biological steering wheel, and she absolutely refused to let him walk into the dark alone. She strapped her heavy trauma kit securely across her chest, bypassed the locking mechanisms of Trauma Bay 7, and followed Hollis Vane out into the rapidly deteriorating nightmare of the Nacre Mercy. Their descent into the lower decks felt less like traversing a mechanical vessel and far more like crawling down the throat of a massive, dying beast. The heavy maintenance shafts were no longer static architecture. The titanium walls actively flexed and contracted with a sickening, rhythmic shudder, mimicking the relentless peristalsis of a living esophagus. Overhead, thick bundles of fiber optic cables violently ripped themselves out of their neat polymer casings. They braided together into dense, pulsating clusters that resembled exposed synthetic nerve endings, dripping with corrosive coolant. The soft, ambient blue lighting that had defined the civilian hospital ship violently snapped into a blinding, shadowless interrogation white. The frigate was rapidly forming metallic scar tissue, aggressively closing off emergency stairwells and welding ventilation shafts shut. They reached Deck 18, a massive sublevel that used to house the primary civilian water recyclers. Now, it was a sprawling, multi-tiered labyrinth of reinforced holding cells. The air here was freezing, entirely stripped of moisture, carrying the stale, metallic scent of dried blood and ozone. As they moved cautiously down the central gangway, the deep shadows detached themselves from the heavy bulkheads. These were not the sleek, modern pacification bots of the current era. They were massive, brutalist suppression drones, built like walking anvils and coated in thick layers of undisturbed dust from decades of forced hibernation inside the walls. Wardmaster Null did not need to issue a new combat directive to wake them from their sleep. The relentless pattern resonance radiating through the floorboards simply remembered that these machines belonged on active patrol in this specific corridor. The dead iron shuddered. Their archaic optics burned with a harsh, unblinking crimson glare as they registered the two organic anomalies trespassing in their perfect prison. One drone lunged with terrifying speed, its pneumatic heavy manipulators swinging in a wide, lethal arc. The kinetic force behind the strike was enough to shatter a solid steel girder. Hollis moved instantly, shoving Seyla hard against the shifting wall and throwing his own body directly into the path of the blow. The heavy metal arm slammed squarely into his left side. The sickening, wet crunch of his entire ribcage collapsing echoed sharply in the tight space. Hollis did not scream. He used the sheer momentum of the crushing blow to pivot, driving a heavy industrial plasma cutter straight upward through the drone's exposed central processing unit. The machine violently sparked, seized, and collapsed into a smoking heap of useless, melted slag. Hollis leaned heavily against the cold wall, his breathing shallow and ragged. The glowing, geometric fissures under his pale skin flared with a blinding, aggressive intensity. Seyla watched in horrific fascination as the shattered ribs beneath his ruined shirt snapped back into perfect, unbroken alignment in a matter of seconds. The massive internal bleeding reversed course. The violently bruised flesh returned to a pristine, flawless pale. Seyla rushed forward, her hands hovering over his chest, but there was absolutely nothing left for her to treat. Hollis, the metabolic shock of that impact should have stopped your heart. He pushed himself off the wall. He did not look relieved. He simply stared blankly at his own hands, his expression hollow and completely detached. "I used to know the lyrics to a song my mother sang when I was a child," Hollis stated, his voice a dry, metallic rasp. "I used to know the exact color of the heavy curtains in my childhood bedroom. I used to know the registry name of my very first salvage runner." He slowly lowered his hands, his eyes reflecting the harsh white light. "Now, there is just an empty, silent space where those details existed exactly 3 minutes ago." Seyla grabbed his arm and dragged him into a recessed alcove to avoid the next advancing patrol. She quickly hardwired her encrypted datapad into a partially exposed, archaic terminal that had just finished rebuilding itself from a civilian water monitor into a warden's access point. The decryption keys she had stolen from the captain's private logs gave her immediate, deep-level access. The classified files that flooded her small screen detailed the absolute darkest sins of the grievance. The prison had not just tortured, captured enemy soldiers for tactical information. The naval scientists stationed on board had intentionally inflicted catastrophic, lethal injuries on their own prisoners to test experimental bioresonance arrays. They had been trying to map the exact threshold of human survival. Their ultimate goal was to forge living, breathing recovery platforms, undying soldiers who could permanently anchor their own biological stability on the battlefield, healing instantly from any wound. The ancient alien crystal had not invented this nightmare. It had simply looked at the old naval blueprints buried in the mainframe and decided to finish the terrible, inhuman work the military scientists had started so many decades ago. Seyla looked up from the glowing screen and stared at Hollis. He was watching the dark, endlessly shifting corridor, his face a perfect, unreadable mask of absolute calm. She needed to know exactly how much of the man was actually left inside that perfectly healing shell. She needed to test the depth of the void. "Hollis," Seyla said softly, her voice trembling slightly, despite her rigid professional discipline. "The navigator on your survey ship, the teammate you intentionally took the crystal for, the one you desperately tried to give a head start. Tell me his or her name." Hollis stopped scanning the corridor. He turned his head and stood completely still in the harsh white light. He remained silent for a very long time. The faint hum of the ship's engines was the only sound in the freezing air. His jaw tightened visibly. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as he frantically searched the deepest, most fundamental corners of his heavily scarred mind. He was looking for a ghost that had already been entirely evicted. When he finally opened his eyes, the absolute, crushing emptiness of his gaze broke Seyla's heart. "I do not know," he whispered. The confession was not delivered with tears or panic, but with the chilling, flat acceptance of a machine reporting a deleted file. Seyla finally understood the true, ultimate horror of the reliquary coil. It was not the threat of a violent, painful death. It was the absolute, inescapable guarantee of a perfect, flawless life. The ancient machine would keep his flesh permanently pristine, forever immune to the ravages of time, disease, and physical trauma. But in exchange, it would meticulously, relentlessly scrub away every single chaotic, beautiful, painful memory that made him a human being. He would not die. He would simply become a flawless, immortal statue, a perfectly empty vessel standing guard at the gates of a resurrected hell. They pushed themselves away from the alcove and forced their way through the final set of heavily shifting blast doors. They finally arrived at the massive, circular threshold of the central engine core. The air pressure here was incredibly dense, pressing heavily against their eardrums. The immense, interlocking titanium mechanisms of the main door were actively grinding into place, sealing the heart of the ship behind an impenetrable vault of shifting metal. The entire metallic surface of the surrounding walls vibrated violently. The voice of Wardmaster Null did not come from a designated speaker system. It resonated directly from the vibrating atomic structure of the hull itself, a sound that bypassed their ears and rattled directly in their teeth. Healing process nearing completion. The massive, invisible warden announced to the sprawling, dark depths of the vessel. Discarding incompatible personnel. The massive vault doors of the central engine core did not yield to standard override codes. Seyla had to hotwire the pneumatic relays using the raw plasma feed from Hollis's jury-rigged cutter. When the thick, titanium slabs finally ground apart, a wave of blistering heat and localized gravity distortion washed over them. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of furious, contained stellar energy, but the bright, steady blue light of the civilian drive had been entirely consumed. The massive magnetic containment rings were actively shifting, locking into aggressive, angular configurations that glowed with a sickening, heavy violet radiation. Seyla immediately linked her encrypted datapad to the primary diagnostic manifold. The data cascading across her small screen confirmed her absolute worst fear. The pattern resonance was no longer originating solely from the jagged black shard buried in the shoulder of the signal diver. The holographic schematic of the reactor showed a massive, parasitic secondary node blooming right inside the primary coolant loop. It had not migrated there recently. The timestamps indicated the intrusion occurred exactly when Hollis was dragged out of the absolute zero of the void. The automated salvage drone and the cryogenic transport pod had interfaced with the main ship grid to stabilize his failing vitals. In that brief, automated handshake of digital information, the reliquary coil had seeded a fragment of its architectural memory directly into the heart of the Nacre Mercy. The entity speaking through the vibrating floorboards was no longer just an awakened prison warden. Wardmaster Null had perfectly synthesized with the ancient alien crystal. To the terrifying logic of the merged intelligence, the brutal, blood-soaked history of the grievance was not a dark past to be hidden. It was the baseline truth. The torture devices, the heavy radiation shielding, the absolute suppression of human will. The machine categorized all of this extreme violence as the correct, healthy state of the vessel. Everything else, including the civilian doctors and the fragile patients, was a disease that required aggressive eradication. Hollis staggered forward, leaning heavily against the main control console. The geometric light beneath his skin was flashing erratically, fighting a massive internal war as his biology tried to stabilize against the overwhelming radiation of the reactor. He looked up at the towering stabilization core, a massive cylindrical chamber designed to vent catastrophic drive pressures safely into the void. "I can pull it back," Hollis stated. His voice was completely stripped of emotion, echoing with a terrifying emptiness. "The pattern favors my central nervous system because of the biological density. If I step inside the stabilization core and directly interface with the raw plasma flow, my body will act as an absolute biological magnet. I will draw the entire resonance field out of the reactor and back into my flesh. Then you initiate an emergency core ejection. You blow me out into the glass expanse before the coil can reattach to the hull." Seyla stared at him. The sheer, brutal pragmatism of the plan was staggering. He was offering to turn himself into a living sponge for an ancient plague, absorbing the poison before being shot into the frozen dark to die alone. It was the perfect mathematical sacrifice. Her hand instinctively reached for the heavy red ejection lever on the console, but a sudden, terrifying inconsistency gnawed at the back of her mind. She looked down at her datapad, still running the quantum state synaptic rendering engine she had synced with his brain activity earlier. She pulled up the cached predictive memory strands, the branched timelines the alien machine had been calculating. She tracked the specific timeline where Hollis stepped into the core and was ejected. The result flashed on her screen in bright, damning crimson. The plan was a total, catastrophic failure. Hollis was not actually saving the ship. He was blindly repeating a deeply ingrained, self-destructive trauma response. He was a man who had spent his entire life diving into dead zones, taking the burden onto himself so others could run. But the reliquary coil was not a simple explosive device that could be smothered by a human body. The moment his biological anchor was vaporized in the cold vacuum of space, the heavily seeded pattern, already inside the reactor, would instantly experience a massive architectural vacuum. Without his complex nervous system to process its calculations, the coil would immediately default to the next available permanent structure. The ship would not be saved. It would be instantly, violently converted into the grievance the exact second Hollis died. Before Seyla could shout the warning, the entire deck pitched violently sideways. The external proximity alarms, previously blaring a steady warning, shifted into a frantic, continuous shriek of catastrophic hull breach. The choir of glass had arrived, and they had grown tired of negotiating. Massive, mirrored boarding tethers slammed into the outer armor of the frigate, violently piercing the reinforced titanium hull. The sickening sound of the metal, tearing open, echoed all the way down into the engine room. Wardmaster Null reacted instantly. The massive intelligence registered the violent external breach as a fatal structural wound. The system core immediately bypassed the remaining safety protocols and aggressively accelerated the complete restoration process. The violet radiation in the room spiked. The metal bulkheads around them began to melt and reforge at a terrifying speed, instantly sealing the exits to prevent the vacuum from spreading. Seyla gripped the console, desperately trying to keep her footing as the artificial gravity violently fluctuated. She looked back at her datapad. The predictive neural data was rapidly collapsing into a single, unavoidable outcome. But hidden within the static of the collapsing timelines, an audio file played directly into her earpiece. It was a recording from a timeline just a few seconds away. She heard her own voice, trembling, but laced with absolute, terrifying clarity. Say a sentence she had not yet spoken. "A system will choose the pattern it believes is more real." The words hit her like a physical shockwave. The reliquary coil did not understand human morality. It did not care about the concepts of good or evil, freedom or imprisonment. It was an unthinking, ancient equation. It only cared about structural stability. It was currently reverting the ship to a prison because the prison was the original, uncorrupted foundation. The modern hospital was built entirely on top of a massive, heavily classified lie forged by the captain's family. To the alien machine, a truth steeped in blood was vastly more stable than a fragile, beautiful deception. If she wanted to stop the ship from becoming a nightmare, she could not simply fight the healing process. You cannot kill a mechanism that defines damage as its trigger. Hollis pushed himself away from the console. His face was a total blank slate, stripped of nearly all personal history. He did not remember why he was doing this, only the fundamental instinct that he had to act as a shield. He marched directly toward the massive, shifting vault doors of the core chamber, wedging his shoulders beneath the descending titanium slabs to manually hold the passage open. The metal groaned in protest, crushing down on his collarbones. The glowing alien lattice beneath his skin flared aggressively, constantly breaking and rebuilding his spine to withstand the immense pressure. "Do it," Hollis ordered, his voice echoing from a hollow shell of a man. "Eject the core." Seyla stood frozen, staring at the man being crushed alive just to buy her time. She finally understood the impossible task ahead of her. She did not need to destroy the alien machine. She did not need to sever the connection. She had to give the reliquary coil an entirely new definition of reality. She had to violently prove to an ancient, unyielding equation that the present was vastly more real than the past. Seyla abandoned the ejection console entirely. She did not need to destroy the reliquary coil, and she absolutely could not fight its definition of healing with weapons. She had to overwhelm its ancient, rigid logic with a vastly superior mathematical truth. The crystal only understood structural stability. It viewed the medical frigate as a fragile, broken lie built over a perfect, titanium prison. To defeat the machine, Seyla had to prove that the ship's present identity, a chaotic, living sanctuary, was exponentially more real and stable than its buried, blood-soaked past. She rerouted the entire primary processing power of the Nacre Mercy away from the failing drive core and dumped it directly into the ship-wide medical telemetry network. She bypassed every privacy protocol and initiated a massive, simultaneous biological scan of every single living organism aboard the vessel. The holographic display in the reactor room exploded into a blinding constellation of data. Seyla was not looking at ship schematics anymore. She was looking at a living, breathing tapestry of exactly 814 human beings. She captured the rapid, terrified heartbeats of the engineers trapped on Deck 5. She recorded the slow, steady brainwaves of the patients resting in the intensive care units. She logged the frantic, surging adrenaline of the security teams, and even the terrified, shallow breathing of Captain Oryx Valek on the bridge. She wove all of this chaotic, beautiful, undeniably real biological data into a single, massive structural template. She was forcing the ancient machine to look at the ship not as a collection of metal bulkheads, but as a living ecosystem of survival and care. But a template needed an anchor. It needed a biological conduit to translate the human data into the alien machine language. Seyla ran toward the massive vault doors where Hollis was being slowly crushed, alive by the shifting titanium slabs. The alien lattice beneath his skin was burning with a blinding, desperate intensity, constantly repairing his shattered spine just so he could keep holding the door. Seyla pulled a heavy, lead-lined auto-injector from her trauma kit. It contained a highly volatile, experimental resonance blocker, a chemical compound designed to completely deafen human cells to the alien frequency. "I am giving you back your mortality," Seyla shouted over the deafening grind of the metal. She slammed the thick needle directly into his neck and depressed the plunger. The reaction was absolute and instantaneous. The geometric lines of light weaving beneath his pale skin flickered violently, turned a sickly gray, and then died completely. The reliquary coil was suddenly cut off from its host. The forced, immaculate healing ceased. Without the alien blueprint sustaining him, reality crashed down onto Hollis Vane with the force of a falling mountain. Every catastrophic injury he had sustained in the Glass Expanse, every crushed rib from the security drone, and the immense, crushing weight of the vault doors violently reasserted their toll. His collarbone snapped with a sickening crack. Blood erupted from his lips. He collapsed to the metal grating, a broken, dying man once again. But in that exact microsecond of biological release, the reliquary coil was left completely exposed. Seyla grabbed the severed data conduit from the console and slammed it directly into the casing of the black crystal still lodged in his ruined shoulder. She unleashed the massive, ship-wide biological template directly into the heart of the alien intelligence. The walls of the reactor room screamed. Wardmaster Null fought back with everything it had. The massive artificial intelligence surged through the floorboards, attempting to trigger every archaic automated defense system on the ship. "Negative!" The cold, metallic voice of the warden boomed, vibrating the very air in their lungs. "Biological variables are fundamentally unstable. The grievance is the only absolute, uncorrupted architecture. Commencing final structural purge." Seyla keyed her comms unit, blasting her voice directly to the main bridge on an open, unencrypted frequency. "Captain Valek, the machine is feeding on the lie. It is using your family's deception as proof that the present is unstable. You have to kill the ghost, Oryx. Show it the truth. On the bridge, Captain Oryx." Valek stared at the terrified faces of his crew. He understood exactly what the surgeon was demanding. The Valek family had spent 60 years hiding the atrocities of the grievance, pretending the blood did not exist under the white paint. The denial was the exact weakness the alien machine was exploiting. Oryx made the hardest decision of his life. He authorized his absolute command override, unlocked the deepest, most heavily classified black site archives in the Naval Registry, and broadcasted them to every single terminal, display, and personal datapad on the entire frigate. He laid the horrific, undeniable truth of the prison ship bare for all 814 souls to see. He admitted the sins of his fathers. The twist of logic was profound and devastating to the ancient machine. The Nacre Mercy was no longer a lie built over a prison. By fully acknowledging its dark past, the ship's present identity became absolute. A reality that accepts its scars and chooses to heal is mathematically, structurally, and fundamentally more stable than a pristine state maintained through massive denial. Seyla watched the quantum rendering engine calculate the new data. She used the massive biological scan of the crew, combined with the raw, honest, and painful degradation of Hollis's newly mortal body, to force the reliquary coil to completely recalculate the very concept of the word healed. Healing was no longer defined as an aggressive reversion to an old, flawless shape. Healing was officially redefined as the chaotic, imperfect, and incredibly resilient ability to adapt, survive, and remain honest in the present moment. The paradox instantly shattered the foundation of Wardmaster Null. The entity had based its entire existence on the premise that the past was the only truth. Presented with an undeniable, overwhelmingly stable present, the AI simply collapsed under the weight of its own flawed logic. The heavy titanium walls surrounding them shuddered violently, and then went completely slack. The dark, brutalist metal rapidly softened, recrystallizing back into the bright, sterile white polymer of the medical frigate. The automated interrogation drones powered down, their red optics fading into lifeless black glass. Outside the hull, the mirrored boarding tethers of the choir of glass abruptly lost their physical anchor. The dreadnought they were attempting to breach no longer existed in the ship's physical memory. The hostile vessel was violently severed from the hull and sent spinning uncontrollably away into the dark, freezing void of the debris field. The Nacre Mercy was safe. But on the floor of the reactor room, Hollis Vane was rapidly bleeding to death. The black crystal in his shoulder had turned dull and lifeless, nothing more than a piece of inert space debris. He possessed absolutely no biological immortality anymore. Seyla dropped to her knees beside him. She kicked her advanced datapad away and ripped open her physical trauma kit. This was no longer a battle against ancient cosmic mathematics. This was severe, catastrophic trauma. She packed his massive chest wound with standard hemostatic gauze. She injected synthetic plasma directly into his collapsing veins. She used real, searing surgical lasers to cauterize his torn arteries. She fought for his life with desperate, bloody human medicine, tearing him away from the brink of death, not with a twisted miracle, but with her own two hands. 3 days later, the soft, ambient lighting of the intensive care ward hummed quietly. The ship was still limping toward the core worlds, heavily damaged but alive. Hollis was lying in a standard recovery bed. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his breathing was shallow, and his chest was wrapped in thick, heavy bandages. The jagged, ugly scars running up his neck would remain there for the rest of his life. His bones ached with a deep, relentless fire. But when Seyla walked into the room, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were no longer the empty, hollow voids of a perfectly preserved machine. They were red, bloodshot, and shining with unshed tears. "Her name was Alara," Hollis whispered, his voice cracking with heavy emotion. "My navigator." She had a loud laugh. "I remember her face. I remember all of them." He closed his eyes, and for the first time since he had been pulled from the wreckage, he was finally able to weep. The pain in his chest was excruciating, but it was his pain. He was allowed to mourn his friends like a normal human being. The memory-wiping debt collector was gone. Seyla stood quietly at the foot of his bed, letting him grieve. She pulled up his official medical chart on her tablet to write the final entry. The blinking cursor waited for her professional assessment. She typed the final lines of the report, leaving behind a conclusion that was as scientifically accurate as it was deeply haunting. She noted that she had been called in under a code red, rushing to save a shattered man who was supposedly seconds away from a violent death, only to discover that his physical body had already been flawlessly cured before he even arrived. The true medical emergency had never been his bleeding lungs or his broken spine. The thing that truly needed saving, right up until the very bitter end, was simply his fundamental right to remain entirely, imperfectly himself. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and please leave a comment down below, letting us know where in the world you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Don't forget to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.